Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO. We have a terrific lineup of in-person and live stream programming coming up soon, so please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a quick update. Also, we have kicked off our annual giving campaign to raise money to cover our operating costs so that we can continue to bring you these timely quality programs. Please donate today so that we can continue to bring you this very important nonpartisan programming that helps connect you with the world, help us promote global understanding and civic engagement, which is more important than ever in today's very polarized environment. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, A Conversation with Fred Kempe. And I'd like to introduce our very own Robert Abernathy, who is a longtime Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall board member, for putting today's program together. Bob is founder and president of the Tech Center, chairman of American Standard Development Company, and he serves on the board of Johns Hopkins, Brookings, New America, the Atlantic Council, and the Wilson Center. Bob, I hope you'll join me on screen and let me turn this over to your capable hands.
Thank you, Kim. We appreciate all your wonderful leadership you've made for all of us here in the council. And guys, it's good to have all of you joining us this morning. I look forward to being with you this next hour. We're in a holiday season, religious holidays, secular holidays. We should be relaxing and enjoying more. Thankful that we're in California and not in the Ukraine, Russia, or China. We have liberty and freedom and an awfully good life in comparison with people in many other places in the world. Today is a part of a series of 6 programs in national security. That's defense security, economic security, energy security. Our first program has already occurred. It was with General David Petraeus. Today, we're with Fred Kempe, the CEO and president of the Atlantic Council. December 15th is Fiona Hill. She's a Brookings scholar, probably the most knowledgeable person on Putin that exists in the United States. January 25th, we have Anne-Marie Slaughter, the former dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, and who is the current CEO at New America. Unscheduled are Jason Matheny and Michelle Fournoy. Jason is the new president of the Rand Corporation, and Michelle is the person that many people expected Biden to choose as the Secretary of Defense, but of course he made another choice. Fred Kempe, would you join us, Fred? Fred is the CEO and president of the Atlantic Council. He's been president since 2007. As a matter of fact, he's done a tremendous job with the council. He's quadrupled the size of the council, both in number of scholars and people associated with it, but also with the budget since he took office. Fred, what is the Atlantic Council? What does it do? What is its mission, and how does it relate to the sorts of things we do here in Los Angeles on our World Affairs Council?
Sorry, thank you, Bob, so much for that kind introduction. And beyond that, thank you for your service to so many organizations, but particularly as a vice chair of the Atlantic Council and as a friend and advisor and counselor for these many years. So the Atlantic Council was born roughly 60 years ago, and we're just beginning to close our books for 2022. We will have experienced the most successful year in our history in 2022, as measured by finances, operationally, and most of all, and most importantly, substantively. Our mission statement, this gets to your question, is shaping the global future together. So there are not many words in that statement, but every one of them packs a wallop. So shaping, we're an organization that doesn't want to observe, doesn't want to just write publications and have events. We actually want to move the needle on policy. We want to create a better world. The global future, we think it's up for grabs. Just as the period after World War I, World War II, the period after the Cold War was up for grabs, this period is up for grabs. And so, and that gets to the last word, together. We are an organization that doesn't do America from behind, doesn't do America alone, doesn't do America first. It's always America alongside partners and allies to shape the global future in a better fashion. And clearly this year with Putin's war in Ukraine, what once seemed like rhetoric that this was an inflection point in history, now I think it's hard to dispute. And what seemed like a nice thing to do, allies and partners and friends, now it's absolutely existential for us. And clearly we want to shape an outcome where Ukraine is sustained as a sovereign, independent nation, but we'll come back to that. And then finally, what does this have to do with the work of the World Affairs Council in Los Angeles, but also beyond? We talk about defining challenges at the Atlantic Council that we think we need to own intellectually. And I'll throw off 3 or 4 of them. Navigating major power competition with China and Russia successfully and without war. Number 2, strengthening democracies and open market economic systems in the face of the resurgence of autocracies. Number 3, reinvigorating the international liberal order of institutions that were created after World War II and far into the future: NATO, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF. But the one, and then I could list a couple of others that we have listed. We've laid out 6 key defining challenges for the Atlantic Council. But the one that the World Affairs Council's work gets to, and obviously it touches on all the rest of these as well, is we need to sustain American support for our engagement in the world. And so an educated population on international affairs that not only supports US engagement in the world, but is sophisticated enough to know it's in American interests to remain engaged, and that we are sacrificing our own interests if we retreat into isolationism or disengagement. And so I think coming here and talking to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, whose work I've always admired deeply, it is crucial to that. And then multiply that by as many organizations as you can all across the United States. I think we really need an engaged public, educated public, a public that understands America's role in the world is for our own good.
Thanks, Fred. You are the longest serving editor and associate publisher ever of the Wall Street Journal Europe. You covered the rise of solidarity in Poland, the ascent and fall of Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia, the wars in Afghanistan and Lebanon, the American invasion of Panama, the reunification of Germany, and the collapse of Soviet communism. Historians have scrutinized the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 far more deeply than they had the Berlin crisis that preceded it by a year. For all the attention given Cuba, however, what happened in Berlin was even more decisive in shaping the era between the end of World War II in 1945 and Germany unification and Soviet dissolution in 1990 and then again in 1991. It was the Berlin Wall's rise in August 1961 that anchored the Cold War and the mutual hostility that would last for another 3 decades, launching us into habits and procedures and suspicions that would only fall after the same wall on November 9th, 1989. You wrote a definitive book, Berlin 1961, Kennedy Khrushchev and the Most Dangerous Place on Earth. It's a wonderful book. It's been translated into 13 languages. You have said that you thought that 1961 Berlin was the most dangerous place in the world. You also said you thought that was an inflection point in recent history. Could you please explain both conclusions to us?
First of all, thank you, Bob. The way to any author's heart is to hold up that author's favorite book in front of a large audience. So thank you for doing that. It was my fourth book. It took years to bring together, and I think what the book underscores is that history isn't fate. It's shaped by the people of its time. And in Berlin in 1961, what this book underscores is that President Kennedy made the decision to acquiesce to the building of the Berlin Wall because he thought it would create a safer world by allowing the Soviet Union to stop a hemorrhage of refugees through an open border at that time. Free Berlin was sitting in the middle of Eastern Germany, and Eastern Germany was being controlled after World War II by the Soviets, but Berlin was under four-power control inside there. And so you had literally millions of refugees coming from unfree East Germany into unfree Eastern Berlin, and then crossing into West Berlin, and then flying out. Some flying out, some going through the Autobahn out. But in any case, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging its best and brightest German citizens through Free Berlin. And the Russians were threatening to shut it down by force. And so this book really recounts the decision-making around a lot of people know how the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, but my view was that people didn't know how it was constructed. So that's what this book traces. My big conclusion, is that by acquiescing to Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviets at that time, over the short run, Kennedy made Berlin a more dangerous place. And it led, I think, directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Berlin Wall was built in August of 1961. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis was in October of 1962, so a little bit more than a year later, because Khrushchev thought Kennedy could be had. Khrushchev thought when it came to pushing him up against the wall, that Kennedy would give ground, he would be able to place nuclear missiles on Cuba within easy reach of the US territory. And at that point, the Soviets did not have missiles that could reach to the US intercontinental missiles. That came much later. So this was a big moment. Rather than going into all the details of the book, because I know we have much more to talk about, let me talk about why I think it was the most dangerous place on Earth. It was the one place on Earth that could have triggered a nuclear war. We didn't have enough conventional soldiers to defend West Berlin's freedom or Berlin's freedom if the Soviets had decided upon a conventional attack. And it was really the credibility of our nuclear deterrent that stopped that from happening. If Khrushchev didn't believe in our nuclear deterrent, then Berlin probably would have been lost at that time. I did think that was an inflection point in history. When I talk about this normally, though, I thought it was an inflection point within an inflection point. So I think the three big historic inflection points, and I think we're facing a fourth now, is end of World War I, end of World War II, end of the Cold War, and now yet again with the rise of a more authoritarian China and of course Putin and Russia and what it's doing. At the end of World War I, we got it more wrong than right. We fell into isolationism. The League of Nations effort didn't work. The Treaty of Versailles turned out to be unsuccessful. And we ended up with World War II, the Holocaust, millions of dead. After World War II, we did it more right than wrong. and to a certain extent did something aberrational in American history, which is stayed the course, stayed in Europe, built multilateral institutions along with our allies. That was really the work post World War II. Harry Truman, beginning with Roosevelt, but Roosevelt passes away. Truman picks it up with Dean Acheson, one of the founders of the Atlantic Council, Dean Acheson, and others. And those institutions have stood the test of time. The end of the Cold War, we didn't get entirely wrong. We didn't get entirely right. But people who predicted the end of history, people who thought that things had been decided and capitalism and democracy had won, clearly we're seeing that's not the case now. And so our belief right now at the Atlantic Council, my personal belief, is we're facing another one of those crucial moments in history. And it's unclear whether we're going to get it more right, like World War II and the aftermath of there, or more wrong, like after World War I. And I think the biggest and the most important test and the most dangerous place in the world now is Ukraine.
So what do you see the situation is in the Ukraine? What are the options? What's Putin's thinking?
I see four options, and depending on what month we're in and where we're in the war has now been going on since February 24th of this year. And in shorthand, and then I'll go a little bit more deeply in those options. In shorthand, the options are Ukraine wins, Putin wins, quagmire for months and maybe years to come, war breaks out between the US, NATO, and Russia. So under Ukraine wins, what all you really need is an outcome that maybe doesn't preserve every inch of Ukrainian territory, though that would be my preference, but ensures that Ukraine remains democratic, sovereign, independent, and secure, so that it can secure its own borders, whether that's within NATO, whether that's with its own armaments, etc. That would require a defeat of Putin in one way or another. Either he would stand down because he sees there's no point in continuing, he would be overthrown. Somehow the situation would end in Ukraine's favor. At the moment, militarily, Ukraine has got the edge moving forward, but as they take new territory militarily, he does more carpet bombing from afar, shutting down their infrastructure, particularly energy, heating, water, and going into a very cold winter. This could be a very decisive winter to see what happens. My own view is this is a time when we want to give Ukraine more, not less help, because it's in our interest and ultimately in our interest, particularly if you buy my view that if we had lost Berlin, the world would have turned out to be a much different place. If we lose Ukraine, I feel the same is true. The second option is Putin wins. And to win, he doesn't have to swallow Ukraine whole. He just has to ensure that no one can rule Ukraine without being answerable to Putin, answerable to Russia. Right now, he's a long way away from that, but that would be Putin winning. That he gains enough face, he gains enough of the country, even if it ends up in a undecided situation for some time, that really Russia continues to call the shots, not just there, but also elsewhere in the region, Moldova, Belarus, etc. Third, the quagmire. I'm one of those that don't think that's likely. I think the situation is too volatile. I don't think it's just going to be stuck in the trenches forever. I just think it's a little bit too explosive, too volatile for that. But many people think that's what we're in for, which is many years of this kind of situation. And that is definitely not in Ukraine's interest, where they've lost so many lives already and so much of their infrastructure and costs. And then, of course, what we all want to avoid is that a war breaks out, potentially of a nuclear nature, even if it's only tactical nukes used in Ukraine, where NATO gets involved in a battle with Russia. The Biden administration has been very, very reluctant to take the risks that would go in that direction, to the extent of not giving Ukraine weaponry that can fire outside of its borders and hit actually the targets from which it's being assaulted. So those are the four potential outcomes I see. And right now, I think there's hope for the Ukraine wins scenario, but I think it's going to take some patience on the part of the United States, our European allies, NATO, and it's going to take even more resilience and courage from the Ukrainians who have shown so much courage, bravery, and resilience thus far. Totally unanticipated has been their bravery, and also the Russian military's lack of discipline and lack of morale. So that's playing out in front of it. It is the drama of our times, but it's not the only authoritarian drama that's taking place in the world, as you know, Bob.
How does world energy fit into this analysis that you just made? What are the pieces and how do they relate?
So I think for several years, in our understandable focus on climate change and our understandable desire to slow down our planet's warming through our efforts at mitigating the climate crisis, adapting to the climate crisis to a certain extent, but mitigating it if we can. We forgot, we almost had amnesia. The author, Dan Jurgen, who a person whose writing I admire a lot, talked about it as amnesia. We forgot the term energy security. Putin has reminded us that you have to have an energy transition, certainly from fossil fuels to more renewable fuels. You have to save the planet in that sense. But but we can't do it without energy security. If people don't feel that they have secure sources of energy, then it's going to be hard to convince them to stop fossil fuels. I think Germany in particular followed an energy dependence strategy, whether intentional or unintentional, where they became deeply dependent and even more deeply dependent with Russia over time. What the war has shown is that's not sustainable. And so I think you're going to see Europe go, and we're also already seeing Europe go through a dramatic reordering of where it gets its energy supplies, including LNG terminals in Germany, other new sources being unlocked, Russian sources being reduced. But what we've seen is the weaponization of energy on Putin's part, and the weaponization of food security as well on Putin's part, where we're getting a taste of what the future of warfare will look like. It's going to involve cyber, it's going to involve disinformation, it's going to involve digital means, and it could involve food, and it could food security and hitting the basis of nutrition and hunger. And it could involve, obviously, as we're seeing right now, energy security. To a certain extent, I think Putin would hope that if he can't freeze the West and freeze the Ukrainians into submission, that he might at least freeze Europe enough, create enough inflation so that the political support for Ukraine dwindles over time, because without the support of Europe and the US, it really is hard to imagine that Ukraine will come out of this whole sovereign and free.
You mentioned climate. You were about a week ago in Bali. There were two meetings there, one on climate and another one. Tell us about those meetings.
So we convened our first ever, Atlantic Council's first ever Atlantic Council Global Food Security Forum, and we did it as an official sideline event of the G20. And we were trying to highlight the importance of food security as a human right to food, and then also to highlight my own argument is that it should be an acknowledged war crime when a combatant like Putin, cuts off the ability to deliver food to places that are desperately in hunger of it. Russia and Ukraine together provide 1/3 of the world's wheat. And if that gets cut off, it's not going to be Americans and Europeans by and large that go hungry. It's going to be people in far less fortunate countries around the world. And so we wanted to call attention to that. And doing it at the G20, we were also able to give recommendations to the heads of state, heads of government of the G20, which always works on a host of other issues. This year, it was a particularly important meeting because President Zelensky actually presented a peace plan to the G20, and Putin himself actually did not attend the meeting. So you had really issues, and another issue that was dancing around the G20 is really whose vision for the future of the international order is going to be more robust, deliver for more for the people. Will it be more the Chinese vision, a less democratic, a more ideological Marxist-Leninist vision? Hard for us to believe that people still believe in Marxism-Leninism. That's really at the heart of President Xi Jinping and his leadership in China today. Or is it the US, where you have a lot of our global allies and friends really questioning the sustainability of our democratic system, seeing the shifts and the difficulties, the polarization of our politics here in Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting. Our adversaries are hoping that it shows signs of our weakness, and our allies are worried about our responsibility, our reliability, our credibility going forward. Will we be the same sort of the United States that we've been over the last 70 or 80 years?
One of your scenarios that you mentioned of the four was Putin failing. What do you think we should be doing? Who should be doing it? How they should be doing it to prepare for Putin's failure in case he fails?
So, first of all, I think anyone who's trying to do a regime change policy from outside, A, will fail, and B, it can be used by Russia itself and by Putin itself to rally more support from him, from his countrymen. So let me talk first about, I'll answer your question after first talking about the internal situation. It's almost impossible for us from the outside to know how weak or strong Putin is, because it really depends on a very small circle of people around him, but who are also totally dependent on him. They're dependent on their power on him. They're dependent for their money on him. And so for them to abandon Putin would seem as though, and he has centralized more authority around his individual. And it's interesting, Xi Jinping has done the same thing in a very different situation in China. But the last time there was that much centralized authority in Russia was probably Stalin. And even Stalin had a Politburo and a central committee, which Putin doesn't have. And so you just, with a dictator like that, despot like that, you never know whether he's weak or strong until he falls or survives. Right now, I wouldn't bet on him being overthrown from inside, but you're seeing more economic difficulty leading to more unquiet. The fact that he tried to do a call-up of troops, and the tens of thousands of Russian men left the country rather than serve in the military. Many of the country's best and brightest are speaking with their feet. They're leaving and going elsewhere. So the real question is, how long is that tolerable? My own calculation is, I don't know, but this gets to the answer to your question, Bob, is I think it's up to us to be ready for the moment that Putin is not there, and to reach out to Russia and try to bring them in to I wouldn't say Western civilization, I would say to civilization. The real question for me is, are we going to be an international system that's guided by the rule of law, or will it be more the law of the jungle? And if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, it will be more the law of the jungle, that a despot can say, look, I don't really like this neighbor. I think I'd like to absorb this country. I know this is against international law, but I have the arms and the international community is not willing to stand up against me. So I'm going to do it. What I want to do is find a way to work with the Russian diaspora, many very well-off people, many well-educated people, work also with our allies and friends, particularly countries around Russia, and be ready to implement a plan when Putin disappears in one way or the other. He's not going to live forever. Where we can, through a series of carrots and perhaps some sticks, just say to Russia, look, we missed this opportunity after the end of the Cold War. You should have come more into our structures, maybe even NATO, maybe more even integrated into Europe. Let's really talk about doing this because it's not in your interest, it's not in our interest that this cycle of conflict continues. And so I think we have to think ahead. We have to have foresight to plan for that moment when we have an opportunity to reach out to Russia. A lot of people will argue that if Putin leaves, we could have an even worse leader, an even more dangerous leader. I don't really buy that. I think the situation is economically so bad right now in Russia, demographically so bad, has fallen, this great civilization, this great society, fallen behind in so many ways. And I think if one can reach out at a critical moment, we could set things on a better path all over again.
Your comment about Putin's assembling greater authority over time brings back old memories. I remember when I was in Igor Ivanov's office having sandwiches and cocktails with him. Igor was Putin's national security advisor at the time, but his boss was in front of the Duma at that very moment, demanding that he abolish all the elections of governors across Russia and be able to personally appoint all the governors. And the Duma gave him that permission that very afternoon. Anyway, I'd like to segue to China, where if you looked at the news the last 2 or 3 days, we're now seeing COVID cops marching through the streets of China. We've seen tens of thousands of Chinese demonstrating regarding the situation that has COVID crackdowns in China. I'd like to ask a series of questions about China. What are we learning about Xi's regime and the choice between freedom and Xidom? What's the background childhood of Xi? What did he learn as a young person? Can we have both growth and party control, or are they diametrically opposed? How does Xi's background color his decision-making? Now, I know that initially his father was very privileged. He was denounced by the Communist Party. He was taken away. Xi and his mother were paraded through the town. They were sent into forced labor. He learned the power of government, full control when he was very young. They denounced his father, banished his mother to a rural village, and they both lived in a cave for a while. But what are your thoughts about the situation in China and about Xi and his background?
So thank you for that question. Let me quickly build a bridge between the Russia and the China issue, because I think they are related. To end the Russia conversation, we at the Atlantic Council later today will be hosting an event celebrating the 20th anniversary of the historic Prague Summit, which fundamentally altered transatlantic security and brought in many more countries into NATO. I attended that. Václav Havel, at the time, who was the president of Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic then, after, his quote was, "I think after many centuries, there is a kind of Russia problem that Russia doesn't know exactly where it begins and where it ends." Remains the case, problem today. So if we had met last year at this time, I would have said to you, democracy is weakening, authoritarianism is surging, and has got momentum behind it. And we as free countries, democratic countries all over the world have to figure out what we want to do about that. Now, 1 year later, and I certainly wouldn't wish the war on Ukraine, on the Ukrainians or anyone else in the world. But a year later, both Putin and Xi Jinping are experiencing troubles of their own making. Putin's troubles are he started a war he thought he would easily win, and he's now got domestic discontent. His army is in disarray. As I said, tens of thousands of Russian men, and not just men, also their families leaving the country. I don't know how long it will be before Russia rejoins the community of civilized nations. How long it will be before it gets back to the economic situation it was in a decade ago or even 2 years ago, but it's going to be a while. So he's on his back feet, whether or not he wins this war, whether or not, even if he uses a tactical nuke in Ukraine. I don't think he's going to do that, but I think that would only speed his demise. Xi's mistake, and by the way, they grow out of the same excessive authoritarianism, where there's no checks and balances and nobody to tell you you're doing something stupid, because they're all afraid of you. So you end up doing something stupid, and it can lead, if not to your downfall, just at least to a lot of problems. In Xi Jinping's case, it was his zero COVID policy. But put that on top of which just has not worked, and he's doubling down on it now. You see the protests across China. A biggest challenge to Xi Jinping's rule since he took over about a decade ago. I wouldn't predict him being overthrown. I doubt that that's going to happen, but he can only answer this in one of two ways, which is cracking down even more, which will slow his economy even more and create even more dissent in his country, or by loosening the reins on COVID, loosening on economic reforms, perhaps political reforms, perhaps a little bit, but that could just make him look weak. And so in any case, it's a humiliating situation for him to have these protests all over. So Putin is far weaker than he was last year at this time, his own doing. Xi Jinping far weaker than he was last year at this time. His economy is slowing. He's not coming out of COVID the same way. By doubling down on ideology and on the state, he has, as you said earlier, he's decided upon control over economic growth. I don't know how long that's going to last. Does he at some point lash out on Taiwan because he needs something to draw the nation together in a nationalist kind of way? So I see 2023. I see that 2023 is a crucial year ahead to see how this plays out. But it could be a year of further weakening of authoritarianism, and it could be a year where democracy makes something of a comeback after really being in recession in a global sense, as measured by Freedom House since 2006, 2007. But I think Xi Jinping has centralized power in his own hands as no leader has in China since Mao Zedong. And it didn't turn out so well for Mao Zedong in China when that happened. And so I think it's a crucial picture to watch right now. But at the moment, I think he is weakened, and it's unclear how he's going to address this set of issues.
Thank you, Fred. One last question before we segue to Rachel for questions from my fellow council members. The Supreme Court of the United States is in its weakest moment as it relates to public opinion. The Pew and other polls have shown that support is as low for the Supreme Court as it's been in the last 50 years. How does that situation affect international thinking, particularly in Europe, but other countries of the world, as they think about the United States?
I'm not a Supreme Court scholar, but I was reading recently about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and after a landslide victory he had in 1936, he made a move to sort of stack the Supreme Court, because at that point it was against him because he was following many years of Republican rule. And the Congress and the American people turned against him in doing it. I think the latest decision of the Supreme Court that the tax records of President Trump should be turned over to congressional committees, I think that was a good sign. I think for those who think that the court has just turned totally ideological, which I don't, I think it was a sign that the rule of law would still prevail. But to your larger question, the world is concerned. When the most influential democracy in the world shows signs of weakness, and January 6th was a pretty frightening moment, I think, and not just for us, but for others in the world who believe in democracy and know they need a strong, resilient, effective, capable American democracy to really pull and help pull others with it. And so I think that's what the world is watching. It's not watching a single situation with Roe v. Wade. It's not watching a single situation with the January 6th attack on the Capitol. It's watching more in a general sense of whether the United States democracy will do what it's done in the past, which is self-correct and then come out stronger, or whether there's something that is happening through our money in politics, through gerrymandering, through the polarization into opposing camps, where there's not one set of media that all Americans are even watching any longer. They're picking the information that suits them best, or that defines where they are on the spectrum. I think as the world looks at this, that's what they're concerned about. It's not one event. It's not the Supreme Court. It's not Roe v. Wade. It's not January 6th. It's the whole cauldron, the political cauldron of the United States, and whether this democracy, whether our democracy will come out of this period of time together, effective, stronger, or not. And so, Bob, you've known me long enough. I'm a hopeless optimist. And Madeleine Albright, bless her heart, and she passed away recently, former Secretary of State, used to always say to me, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And so I'm an optimist who worries a lot.
Thank you, Fred. I hope you guys have your questions into Rachel. If you don't, get them into her. And Rachel, it's all yours.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. And thanks to our audience for submitting such great questions. So the first one is, as you are a long-term observer of Germany, what is your assessment of the Zeitenwende, the term for the change of German security, especially defense policy? Is there any substance to it?
So far, I'm disappointed. I was really heartened in the first weeks after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where I thought Olaf Scholz came in, said the right things, made the right moves. The Green leaders in the coalition, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, and also Habeck, the economics minister. I think they're impressive. Zeitenwende, for those of you who are non-German speakers not following this, it's to a certain sense what I've been talking about, which is an inflection point. It's a change. It basically is a turn of time, but it's an inflection point. And the idea is that this was going to be a time when Germany turned and became more of a leader, was willing to spend more on defense, was going to change its energy infrastructure. And I would say that thus far, it's lost momentum. And considering the dangers that Germany is facing with Ukraine and Putin not so far away, I hope it regains momentum again. But at the moment, I'm a little disappointed, and I think this this change of times has to catch new wind and catch and regain some momentum. But right now, I think what started out in a very promising way has lost some momentum and lost political will. You need German leadership in Europe desperately right now. But Germany, after many years of being, to a certain extent, being told not to lead, they're a little bit out of the habit of that kind of leadership. And I think they need to be a little bit bolder in their leadership, knowing that if they don't lead, it's going to be very difficult for anyone else in Europe to do so.
We've had several questions come in about Ukraine, Russia, and NATO, so I want to jump into those. So one audience member asked, several polls have recently reported that public support for continued assistance at present levels of providing arms to Ukraine and rejecting negotiations with Russia is dropping and threatened by a Republican House. In this scenario, does accepting Russia's offer to negotiate become more likely?
Well, first, let's make clear that Russia is not offering to negotiate. Russia is just bombing the hell out of Ukraine and killing civilians and hitting infrastructure. They're committing one war crime after another. And so, and the Ukrainians, after there's no Ukrainian leader after having his country suffer this much, who's going to be able to stand back and take a deal that doesn't, maybe Ukraine doesn't get back every inch of its territory. I can understand that. But it has to be a peace deal that that isn't a timeout that gives Russia the time to rearm and come back stronger. But it has to be a deal that really assures Ukraine's freedom, security, and independence going forward. There's been a great debate that's gone on about whether bringing the Baltics and Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc., into NATO was wise or not wise, and whether that was what made Russia turn more anti-Western. I talked I talked some to President Clinton during that time and afterwards, who was crucial to all that, and he believes that doors were opened to Russia, and had Yeltsin been healthier, had he lasted longer in office, he might well have been the leader that brought Russia closer to the West. And it was really just, have we made mistakes? We've made mistakes, but Russia has its own free will. And I think if you ask anyone in the Baltics or Poland whether they're better off being in or out of NATO, all you have to do is have them point to Ukraine and point to themselves. It's Ukraine that's out of NATO that's being attacked. And it's the countries that are in NATO that are secure and peaceful and safe. So anyone who argues that NATO has somehow been part of the problem, I personally am on the side that doesn't buy that. And I even wonder whether in 2008, when we gave lip service to Ukrainian membership, but really didn't start down the path, whether if we had started down the path at that time, whether Ukraine would actually be more secure than it is now. That's a debate. History doesn't reveal its alternatives. We won't be able to settle that debate. But my own view is that it's really a strength that brings about security and not weakness when you're facing an authoritarian, dictatorial, expansionist regime.
Thank you. So staying on NATO, everyone in the West talks about Putin's red lines. What about NATO's red lines? Why have we not made it public and clearly stated what Putin will not be allowed to do vis-a-vis Ukraine?
I think those red lines have been communicated privately to Putin. And I think he knows that striking any NATO country in any way, shape, or form would trigger Article 5 of the NATO Founding Act, which would be, it's the all for one, one for all clause, where if he bombs Poland, we are obligated under law not to go to war with Putin, but to respond in some way. The missile that hit Poland that turned out to be a Russian defense missile that was trying to knock down Russian missiles. It would have been interesting to see what would have been the response had it been a Russian missile gone astray. I don't think anyone's looking to escalate to war, but you see how careful Putin has been not to hit NATO territory, that he knows that's a red line. I hope he's been told that using a nuclear weapon, even if it's a tactical nuke in Ukraine, is a red line. I hope he knows that. And so I think those are our red lines. I sort of wonder whether one of our red lines ought to have been right from the beginning, these civilian attacks, which are a violation of the UN Charter. But you know, if you draw a red line, then you have to be willing to respond when somebody crosses it. So I think part of the reason one doesn't make public these red lines is it just wins you more diplomatic flexibility not to do so. Don't forget that President Obama had a red line in Syria about the use of chemical weapons, and then he backed off from that red line when it was actually crossed by the Russians. And that made him look weak enough that I do think that had something to do with Putin's decision to then take Crimea shortly thereafter, because I think he just calculated that President Obama, rightly calculated that President Obama wouldn't do much to respond to that.
So this audience member said, I live in California, but have been spending a lot of time in Asia currently and find many people there with sympathies for Russia and China. How will India and China behave in regards to the Ukraine war over the next several months?
How will India and China?
Yes.
India's in an interesting position because no country has increased its, I think this is factually correct. I haven't checked this fact, but this is, I think, true, that no country in the world has increased its purchases of Russian oil more than India. And if that's not correct, it's certainly one of the top 2 or 3. And they need the oil to run all sorts of manufacturing and refining facilities that they have in India. They see this as just good politics to buy the oil at steep discounts. I think India and the leader of India, Modi, has a very close relationship with Putin. I think they're staying neutral. I don't think we're entirely happy with that. But on the other hand, I think there's been a decision not to put pressure on India that probably wouldn't pay off anyway. And you hear people talking about, some of you who studied the history of the last century know about the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, and that was really led by India. Some people are talking about a non-aligned. So there are roughly 40 countries that have signed on to our sanctions on Russia. There are only a couple of countries that are actively, with Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. And roughly 140 countries. Some of them have voted again. In fact, most of them have voted against the Putin's annexation of the 4 territories of Ukraine. But most of them are not involved in the war, either supporting one side or another. So this is a new non-aligned, and I think India is probably the most important country in that group. China is in a really interesting situation because in early February, ahead of February 24th, Xi Jinping signed his no limits agreement with Putin just ahead of the Beijing Olympics. And certainly the US government is of the opinion, and I believe this to be the case, that Putin told him what he was going to do. And certified that he wouldn't do it until after the Olympics were over, and he didn't do it until after the Olympics were over. I don't think Xi Jinping ever imagined that he would go as far as he does. what Putin has done really hurts China's play for global leadership, because the Chinese argument is that we don't side with democracies, anti-democracies. We just believe in national sovereignty, and we believe in the sanctity of international borders. Well, if there's one thing Putin's invasion of Ukraine has shown us, he does not believe in the sanctity of borders. So, as I understand it, I think China and Russia are in too deep for them to break the relationship. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Xi Jinping is proud of the fact that he has as close of a relationship with Russia as he does, and they've been historically rivals. The US seems to believe that the Chinese have been careful not to overtly break sanctions and not to excessively deliver military means to support the fight. I think the longer this goes on, the worse it is for Xi. And so I think it's really important to watch this closely. I think part of the reason you don't see the Biden administration sort of fueling the protests and or rhetorically fueling the protests in China right now is partly because they don't think it would do any good anyway, it would only hurt the cause, but also because Biden made some progress with Bali in starting to get a better conversation going with China. And ultimately, they hope that that would help them deal with the Russia situation as well. So it's a very complicated situation, but the questioner did point out the two countries in the global room that I would watch most closely in this case, because India is defining itself as a global power. Where is it going to throw itself down? And China is now facing some really important questions about who they want to be in the world, and can they really continue to ally themselves with Putin as he moves forward in the war as much as they have thus far.
I think we have time for one final question. So this audience member asked, can Putin be charged with war crimes? If yes, who charges him? And if he is charged, does that mean that he can no longer leave Russia without fear of arrest?
There are people, including at the Atlantic Council, we have a strategic litigation project that's just brilliant, led by someone named Gisu Nia, under our Middle East programs, led by Will Wexler, and they do a lot of work in this area. I am a non-expert. It is a prima facie case that there are war crimes. We see them unfolding in front of us every day. And there are a number of organizations cataloging them, including we're doing some work with our Digital Forensic Research Lab looking at that as well. The question of, how they get prosecuted, where do they come to? I mean, typically it would come to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. That court would then bring sanctions, bring suggestions. How that would play itself out, I don't know. My own guess is it's more likely that Putin leaves the global scene by other means than any international criminal court would ever get to him. And in terms of not being able to leave the country, if he is put in a position where he wants to step down and wants some sort of protection against prosecution, I think it's going to be a very interesting question for global leaders, because I think most people will want to give him I won't say almost any deal, but will want to get him out of the way. And if they can get him out of the way, and part of getting him out of the way is protecting him against prosecution, I think there are leaders of many countries that would take that deal.
Thank you so much again. And Mr. Abernathy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Fred. We appreciate you being here with all of us today. It was very nice of you to do that. And we appreciate all the good work you've done trying to help the world be a better place to live in. I would like to hope that most of you guys on with us today will be back on December 15th, where we have Fiona Hill with us. We've talked an awful lot about Putin today, and Fiona probably knows as much or more about Putin and every facet of him as anybody living in the United States does today. So it's going to be an interesting program. So return on the 15th and please start to have a good, relaxing holiday session with your families and enjoy this month.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both again for joining us today. It was such a phenomenal conversation, and I want to thank our audience as well for joining us. As Bob mentioned, we have a terrific lineup of upcoming programs, both in person and online, in addition to the ones that he mentioned. Next week, we have 2 wonderful in-person opportunities. So on Monday, December 5th, join us for a conversation with former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. Then on Friday, December 9th, we'll host Estonian Ambassador Christian Prick. Also save the date for February 5th, when we'll host journalist Nina Totenberg for an in-person conversation. We also have several live stream programs before the end of the year. On December 6th, join us at 11 a.m. for a live stream with Pew Research on citizen engagement in the digital age, and then at 5 p.m. for the Dan Schnurr Political Report. On December 14th, we have the Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine with former RAND CEO Jim Thompson and Sir Lawrence Friedman, who is Professor of War Studies at King's College. On December 15th, as Bob mentioned, we'll have Fiona Hill, and she'll be doing a very special conversation with Mr. Abernathy. Thank you all for joining us again today. You can find more information about all of the programs I just mentioned on our website, and you can register there as well. I ask you to please also consider making a donation to our year-end campaign by December 31st to help us continue to bring the quality programming that you watched today. So thank you all again, and we hope to see you in person on Monday for our conversation with Mark Esper.